Our second keynote speaker is Roderick Simpson, who is the Environment Commissioner from the Greater Sydney Commission. Rod is an architect and urban designer and an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building here at UTS. And Rod led the urban design for the City of Sydney Sustainable Sydney 2030 strategy. He's a member of several housing, transport and architectural design review panels, including the Landcom Design Advisory Panel. And he's going to give us our second keynote address. So please welcome Roderick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I too, of course, would like to start by recognising the original custodians of this land. Once was, always will be Aboriginal land, and recognise that if we care for country will care for us. And I think it might be a way of thinking about country as our country being the public domain, in fact. That is our shared country. And so the way that we treat our public domain, what a wonderful presentation. The way we have respect for the public domain and how we might inhabit it, I think is absolutely what we're interested in. I always try to keep to topic, and I've been asked to talk about policies and resources. Then looking back over the years of what had happened here previously, I'm not going to talk about resources because there's a plethora of resources, fantastic resources on the Fit New South Wales website. I'm going to concentrate on policies and think about the relationship of policies in the Greater Sydney Regional Plan in particular in relation to health. What's the overall regional strategy about? It's about rebalancing the city. It's about recognising that we've got inequities across the city. Here are two mappings of what could be 50 maps, and I'll show one more in a moment. The one on the left is social disadvantage. The one on the right is the high-performing schools. We've built on strength for 200 years. At the same time, that sometimes embeds weaknesses. Looking at the health, there's the mapping of mortality and the ages that are associated with that. You can see the correlation. City of Sydney, of course, jumps out because it has a concentration of low-income social housing. I think that would explain that apparent anomaly. On the right is a very simple, I used an American diagram because it's quite clear. You can see here it says the physical environment's only 10% of a possible effect of health. The socioeconomic factors at the top, of course, are the major drivers of personal health from an environmental perspective, I guess. And therefore, you can see the correlation, of course, from what I showed just a moment ago to what we should be addressing, which, of course, is broad-scale inequity and the capacity of people to look after themselves and be healthy, as well as a concern for the physical environment. Here's just the stats on what we're talking about. This is the movement of people. This is basically showing where people live and work, simply showing that a lot of people who live in the West have to be transported out of that area. So that, of course, is not simply a cost, it's also an imposition on their time with their families and so forth. So, in other words, more stress, and of course, there's associated health impacts with that. So what have we done about that? We have the metropolis of 3 cities. The big idea, I suppose, is that there are 3 cities and that they should all be relatively equivalent in the opportunities they provide to residents and so forth, equivalent levels of health, opportunity and access to education and so forth. And that, of course, is distilled, if you like, down to the idea of the 30-minute city. We haven't got 20 minutes yet, but we're maybe the next iteration of the plan, because 20 minutes probably is a much better thing to be aiming for. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what I'm going to point out are the mentions in the Greater Sydney Regional Plan which can be taken as policy. It is a document that's been adopted by the New South Wales government and has gone through Cabinet as a result. So to a certain extent, it's not really stretching it too far to say this is government policy. In other words, the words in here are important because they're for you to use. So that when we talk about things here, these are the hooks, these are the things that can actually be brought into your strategies to then inform your plans. And so when we look at great places that bring people together, walking streets, 10-minute walk to centres, community hubs, place character and so forth, parking, there's quite a lot of attention to parking, which I'll talk about more and I'll explain why later. Adaptability of places over time, electric car charging, communities are healthy, resilient and socially connected, walking co-location, and fresh food, which I've just skipped over. And then we also then look at some of the more environmental things. And I'll talk a bit more about the impacts of extreme heat later. But in all of these, what I'm saying is that this is in fact on topic. This is the policy. So it's a policy that's there for many of you to use. And I guess my big proposition today is that as a range of health professionals, I would encourage you to insert yourself into as many planning processes as possible. But a bit of a diversion for just a moment. When we think about environmental health, this is the sort of health conditions we had around the turn of the last century, and that involves slum clearances and so forth. If we go elsewhere, to London perhaps, the association of health and income and disease is nothing new, and it was mapped in the United States back in the late 1700s. Nothing new. What did we do about it? Well, we tended to invest massive amounts of money on hard infrastructure. You may not be aware that actually 75% of the spend in the Haussmannisation of Paris is invisible. It's infrastructure, it's sewers. It's basically making the density of that city possible by providing health infrastructure. That's what that is. That's health infrastructure that we're looking at there over on the far right. To jump to Tokyo. Why the hell would I jump to Tokyo? The reason I would is because the current density of Tokyo is around about 6,000 people per square kilometre. In 1800, it was 39,000 per square kilometre. Not in 5-6-storey buildings, but in 1, 2, very occasionally 3-storey buildings. How on earth was that possible? A very simple point, but I think, an important one. It's because we have to see cities as systems. The only reason that this was possible was because of the way the city worked. Pedestrianised transport, heavy transport of bulky goods by the canals, no horses, no cow dung, no horse dung that was the blight of London back at about the same time. And when we look at the densities then, you can see down the bottom there that it actually got up to 80,000 people per square kilometre. That's 3 times the density of Paris currently. Paris is about 26,000. How is that possible? This is why it was possible. There wasn't disease in Tokyo because the night soil and the urine in particular was a highly valued product. So the streets were scrupulously clean, as they still are. And people, of course, had the actual behaviour of basic washing and hygiene and bathing, of course, as a deeply embedded part of the culture. That's what allowed 80,000 people per square kilometre. So what I'm saying here is this very simple point, actually. The way we have to think about the city is as a system of systems, both spatially, but actually integrated systems which are highly interconnected. So that's the way I think we can deal with complexity, through place-based planning, because we can't possibly deal with the whole city as a whole all at once. We can deal with it place by place, because place by place, as we've just heard from Lucy, is where you see all those interactions. That's where you can see how things work or don't work. And so we build the city, of course, piece by piece, place by place. That's why we talk about place-based planning so much in the plan. The complexity of the city, this is just a mix of housing. I'm just using it as a graphic really to show the complexity that we're dealing with. And we talk about it at some length. And of course there's the work that's being done by the government architect as well. So systems are about integrated thinking and collaboration. And place-based planning forces collaboration. It necessarily forces integration. You can't avoid it. You can't avoid it, but it's also more possible because you can deal with that complexity of those interactions locally. You can have a conversation with the person who's going to be making a decision. It doesn't have to go all the way up the line and all the way back down again. So collaboration is absolutely key. Another representation of what we're talking about. All these aspects, actually it's the interaction between those aspects that go to make a great place. A reworking of Lucy's slide I just worked up in the last couple of minutes. Integrated place-based planning, of course, though, if we look at the way that we've set up our bureaucracies, our institutions, everything has been service delivery in silos. policy delivered through silos or grants or one-off projects with an outcome, absolutely, but that outcome always very, very tightly defined because someone's paying for it. They want to see the result in relationship to that particular aspect. On the other hand, when we look at a place, of course, it's how all those things actually deliver together on time in the same place and interact that produces a great place. So what is the relationship between health and education? An example, when we talk about collaboration areas, we now have some examples of what the hell we're talking about. Liverpool Place strategy is a result of a couple of years of collaboration at all three levels of government to a certain extent, but the private sector, major institutions like New South Wales Health, universities, local government, Department of Land and Housing Corporation and so forth, all actually recognising that they're all working in the same place. And it starts to then suggest, well, what's the relationship between health and education? And this is just showing the idea of a maturity where we say, well, it's not just then the research activities, it goes beyond the research activities to other associated activities, and then that goes to actually how the housing might work with people who work in the hospital, and we can tease that out later because in fact, as I'll talk about later, 17% of people who live in the city centre of Liverpool walk to work. Where do they work? In the hospital, right? Because so you see how it starts to become the understanding of how a particular place, that's not everywhere in Sydney, but how the potential at every single place needs to that collaboration. And then, of course, once we've done that, we can start to elaborate it and think about the more detailed livability aspects. Very recent work, hot off the press from Liverpool Council, because we've got an overall vision now for the economic future of Liverpool and the institutional future of Liverpool. But I'll use another example. This one's, again, fresh off the press from associates at Mosaic Insights. This is down in Melbourne at Sunshine Hospital. Over on the left you can see yellow, that's the hospital. On the right, and you can see the red outline there, which is a creek. There's the creek in its beautiful fulsomeness right now. And what they're looking at is actually the integration of the activities of these two things. And so they're actually talking to the hospital about what's the therapeutic activities, the recovery activities that can actually use that open space immediately adjacent that would have been actually closed off as an integral part of the hospital's operations. And so then, of course, that then starts to mean that there's an investment in that forgotten waterway. And it means, I think I've lost some, oh no, here we go. Didn't realise I had animations as well. So what they're looking at is how this all builds, and they're building on the research. And of course, once we do these little experiments, this is invention. But if we want systemic change, of course, it then has to be applied at scale across an entire city. So this is mapping the opportunities for that. If we look at Sydney, my God, there's opportunities everywhere. Right? We have a network of forgotten waterways that go through the entire city. And so when we map that, and as we have, so this is the green grid work from the government architect from a few years ago, it gives a framework for local government, which you can see in the middle, which is Parramatta Council, to iterate that down to a finer grain, and then, of course, to be able to engage with their community about what the transformation might look like on their street with a cooler and safe travel path to the local light rail line that's being put in. A complete story, because that's what, of course, we can engage the public with. And the examples then of actually restoring those creeks. And that's why in the Greater Sydney Regional Plan, again, policy. It looks like urban design stuff, but actually what it's saying, it is. But what it's actually saying also is we need to change the way we plan in the Western City to start with the water systems, to the green systems, where we might put the greatest density to take advantage of that amenity, and then work out where the transport goes to service that in terms of public transport and cars. When you think about it, that's the exact opposite sequence to the way we plan at the moment. We always leave the bikeways, the cycling, the amenity to the end. We start with transport and think that that's what it's all about. Very important, but if we flip it around the other way in terms of priorities, as Lucy's touched on, then we've got a completely different system. The other point I'd make is that when we do these big projects, in terms of those narrow project definitions, it's important that when we think about our priorities, we load those projects up. If we're spending literally billions and billions of dollars, let's spend a few million more and actually get a much better outcome for the local area. So this is the fantastically titled level crossing removal program. I mean, it has got a real ring to it. I'm sure the traffic engineers got very excited by it. It's got its own website. But the built result is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. It's stitched back together communities. It's actually provided all this active recreation, easily accessible, as an integral part of a major transport initiative. Canterbury Bankstown engaged with us thinking about their future, and of course you can see on the right the growth of the city. And of course the first thing that would spring to mind is, oh my goodness, when we have growth we're going to have more congestion. So the normal process would be, if we're focusing on transport as being the first concern, and motorised transport in particular, we would then try and solve that problem in a narrow sense. Instead of which, what Bankstown and Canterbury did was say, no, hang on, let's start with the pedestrian environment. Let's start with the idea of complete streets. So whether we call it complete streets or movement in place or Lincoln Place or all of these other guidelines or healthy streets, we actually all know what we're talking about. But it's been, of course, much more clearly put by Lucy just a moment ago. But that's what we're talking about. And so there's key recommendations which, of course, embed that then as giving pedestrians priority. And that then flows through to a whole lot of measures. So safety suddenly becomes the major determinant of how we design those intersections and those streets in that highly pedestrianised centre. And of course, there's no secrets here. We have the evidence. I should stress that I've put those two things together. This is not in the Canterbury Bankstown document, but the complete streets really leads to the suggestion, I think, of, well, what is a safe speed in these highly pedestrianised environments? It ain't 40 kilometres an hour, right? And I would raise the question, and I'm happy for this to be recorded, if we have the evidence and we know that there's that critical point of 30, and it's the default through Europe and Korea, and we know that that's actually the thing that's going to produce a markedly more safe environment, I think it's a reasonable question to say, by default, why shouldn't a street be 30? Tell us why it needs to be more than that to get the traffic moving around. Anyway, there you go. So I promised to talk about parking, because it's actually my favourite subject, best till last. And the reason I'm talking about parking is because there's only a few things really we can play with in terms of the levers in the way people behave, and parking is actually one of them. And it's hidden in plain sight, that lever. So when we look at Liverpool, and you can see it identified there over on the far left, no surprises in the middle of Liverpool, and here's a number of other city centres around Sydney: Blacktown, Liverpool, Parramatta, Waverley, Bondi Junction. We've got to stop thinking about the city as being an undifferentiated entity. We've got to stop thinking in terms of averages. We've got to start thinking about what are the particular characteristics and opportunities in each piece of the mosaic, and to calibrate our policies and our interventions and our planning, which is only possible through collaborative conversations in these places, as you saw a moment ago in Canterbury Bankstown. Now, why am I saying that? I know this is a bit hard to read, I'm sorry, but what it shows, and you'll have the slides later anyway, is the very distinct difference between the rest of the suburb and those areas within that suburb in terms of car ownership and the journey to work. And you can see that actually where people are living around railway stations, because they were all railway stations, there is less car ownership and there is more walking. So surely then we should be actually picking up on that and using that single lever, and again, the evidence is in there, the single major determinant of whether people will own and use a car is the availability of parking. You may not be aware that in Tokyo you have to accommodate your car on site. There's no street parking basically. And so, hey presto, when land value is like it is in the middle of Tokyo, people make the decision that they are not going to drive. And you can see it here. So I'm hoping that's 5 minutes. It is good. Just thought I'd check. So I'm not suggesting these are averages. But imagine Sydney where, yes, you can live as it might be in Canberra, in some of the outer suburbs, that's fine. But I think there's places in Sydney where it might be more like Barcelona, or it might be more like Helsinki, who, as you can see there, has a fairly substantial amount of cycling Gets down to -7 in Helsinki, so I think that is definitely an average, but let's just see. But maybe not so much in winter, we'll see. But the parking, again, don't just think about it as parking. I know you can't read that, you can read that later. What this is showing, though, is all of the aspects that then link to a single policy about parking. Should it be adaptable, convertible? How do you actually provide it? Is it decoupled and so forth? In other words, it's a very powerful lever for actually how we design our centres. And that's going to take another lot of discussion with politicians. So in other words, I'm suggesting health considerations are everywhere. This is about the size of supermarkets. You see, I don't know that health would normally be associated with supermarkets, except in the sense that it should be reasonably accessible. Right? We've got policy about that. But if we allow the concentration of large supermarkets so that they're 4,500 square metres rather than setting a maximum of, say, 900, the economics of that means they need a certain population, and that'll be over a relatively low density area. Of necessity, it will mean that it's going to be car dependent, and it will actually locate itself according to the population that's going to patronise it. It's that simple. It's a mechanical, it's a mathematical formula. So health would need to have a say in the location of supermarkets if we want to have not only the access to fresh food, but also the walking and cycling and so forth in terms of activation. So you see what I'm saying, that actually, as health professionals, I think not a matter of responding through checklists necessarily only, but getting in there in the mix in terms of the considerations for how the planning is done, you have an essential part to play. And this is what is actually happening in the ACT government. In order to revitalise the small neighbourhood centres, they put a cap on the size of supermarkets to actually counteract what's happened with the changes in demographics and car use over the original planning from the 1970s. Extraordinary levels of walking to school, walking to local shops back in the 1970s, and they're trying to restore that. And it's in Ireland as well. So, very last couple of slides on extreme heat, because I promised I'd speak about it. Yes, it's the highest mortality for natural disasters we know. We're talking about the development of the Western Parkland City, that's Waianamadda or South Creek catchment outlined in red. There's the green grid across the entire city. There's the extreme heat. You can see the one at the top there, which is red, which is Penrith, is actually going very hot already and getting much hotter. That's what we're building. This is then the modelling of how we might respond to that through a range of strategies. Not simply planting trees, because the trees will need to be irrigated. They need to be irrigated to stay alive, but they also need to be irrigated to also then evapotranspire to actually cool the air. We need cool materials. In other words, what are you looking at here? You're looking at a systemic response. It's complex. The only way to address that complexity is by looking at how the whole place works. If we look at the way the whole place works, you can see in that simple section there, we've got road engineers, we've got landscape architects, we've got the water services, we've got the development control plan for the form of buildings. Right? It's complex. And the only way to deal with that complexity is, I think, through place-based planning. And when I say it's also complex to really get to grips with what we're trying to achieve. If we started off by saying we were concerned with mortality from extreme heat, people tend not to die in the local parks in extreme heat. They tend to die indoors. They die indoors because they possibly are in an inefficient house, and being in an inefficient house means they possibly can't afford to air condition it. They might not be able to even put in the air conditioner. So you can see then how we've got to see, as you can see over there on the far right hand, there's formal systems, but then the overall health of people and the overall capacity of people to look after themselves is absolutely essential. So in terms of resilience, we're going to be always thinking about the health, the personal capacity, and then the formal structures. Because a disaster is when those formal and informal systems fail. That's the definition of a disaster. So, last slide. Place-based planning, always think of it as being systems, harnessing those large projects, and I think health aspects are everywhere. Thanks.